And I'll say good evening once again to Garfield Ginny Newman, who is our presenter tonight, and to all of you from across the province of Ontario who have joined us for this OTF Connects session. So we welcome all of you and hope you enjoy your night. Tonight we're really excited to welcome Garfield Ginny Newman as our presenter. Garfield is an experienced presenter in many ways, certainly not just with OTF Connects, but we're really pleased that he's here with us tonight. He's an associate professor at OISE U of T and also a consultant with the Critical Thinking Consortium, and I'm pretty sure he'll be speaking about that tonight. He's also a speaker and an author and loves to work with teachers and challenge us to think about critical, creative, and collaborative thinking, and in this case, I think, related to social studies tonight. So Garfield, I'd like to give you a warm welcome, and I'm going to turn my mic off, and then you can take over from here.
Great. Thanks so much, and welcome everyone. And as Susan said, it's really wonderful to see how widespread the participation is tonight across the province, which is really neat. I'd like to start by, I'm just out of curiosity, and I hope this doesn't come across like it's not meant to. Why give up your evening for this conversation? In other words, what are you hoping to get out of it? What kind of questions do you have? Why does the topic resonate? If you wouldn't mind just very quickly, you can either jump on the mic or type in the chat window just to give me a little bit of a sense of questions you might have, hopes you might have for the evening, why the session attracts you. That would be helpful. It may help me tweak things as we go, and it will help me understand the kind of issues that teachers are facing in the classroom. So I'm just going to pause just for a moment, and I'm going to turn my mic off and just let you take a minute just to give me some insights. Thanks. So thanks, and I'll continue to looking for new ideas. I'm curious, Melanie, I think you started us off with, I know that you've been trying and playing with inquiry in your classroom, and what I'd like to know, and I see Lucas in a similar way, how has that been going? Have you found the inquiry working as well as you want? Have you found that there are some drawbacks or barriers to inquiry? I noticed some people wanting to increase student engagement, and I'm wondering if there's an implicit piece in there that we need to engage them in wanting to inquire, or just a little bit on that would be helpful. Okay, great. This is great. Thank you so much. So I'm going to get started by, I just want to have a little bit of broad contextual conversation if we could, and I've just pulled for the first few slides, and I think that there won't be a lot that's new or to you, but I do want to raise a question. So I've just pulled vision for Canada and World Studies and for the Social Studies Canada and Geography, History and Geography piece. And you can see that the ministry statement, Social Studies, History, Geography, is to enable students to become responsible, active citizens in diverse communities, become critically thoughtful. So right in there, some of you are talking about more critical thinking, being able to solve problems, communicate ideas. So that's some of the kind of mission and what I think we need to see. This is also from the front matter in the curriculum, that the inquiry process, and which is why I think there's a lot of buzz around this going on around the province. How do we teach through an inquiry approach? And you can see from the ministry's document that it begins with, in the center of those cogs, formulating questions. Somebody said getting kids to ask better questions. So getting kids to frame questions that will actually lead to inquiry. You'll see the being able to gather, organize, interpret, analyze, evaluate, communicate, and so on. So I'm showing you this piece, and then connecting the pieces, you can see the goals, the vision that we've just touched on, a citizenship framework, and then applying what's new to the curriculum is disciplinary ways of thinking. So there's a focus on historical thinking and geographic thinking, using the inquiry process, feeding into those expectations. Someone noted recently in a session, so I just see a note of sound going on and off. Susan, I'm just going to pause. Is it happening for you? I'm trying to figure out if it's me on my end or if it's the other links.
No, it's sounding just fine from our end, Garfield. Okay,
so we'll keep an eye on that. May just be the one particular computer. So what I was saying is, the front matter is the spirit of the curriculum. It's the intent that lies behind the curriculum. And as we dig into the expectations, we want to keep that in mind. I also pulled this piece just to highlight, the focus that the ministry has taken on critical thinking, making a judgment, guiding decision making, recognizing critical literacy as a capacity, as a particular type or subset of critical thinking, and notice that the students reflect on and so on. So these are the pieces, as I say, that frame it broadly. I have to say, to be quite frank, I think the front matter, setting up an inquiry process, inviting students to think critically is wonderful. I want to caution that often the sample questions that are included in the document actually aren't critical thinking questions. So the spirit, the intent is there, but at times we do need to be careful to tweak some of the questions because many of them are in fact still lists or recall or retrieval questions that we still need to work on. But the spirit and the intent is there, and I think that's what's important. So here's what I want to just take a moment to think about and to jot some thoughts. Do you think that from what you've seen, and I'm doing this early on and then I'm going to revisit this in a moment, do you think this new curriculum, the 2013 Social Studies History Geography curriculum, would you argue it's a renovation of curriculum documents past, that we've made some improvements, almost like a home renovation, or is it a revolution? Is it a completely new direction? So would you say, as I say here in my question, is it a retooling or a complete new direction in education? So I'd love if you could just type your response or jump on the mic. And as you're thinking about that, what are the implications for how kids learn, how we teach, and issues it may raise for you? So I'd love to see, seeing some comments already. And could I get, if you don't mind, I see, Louise, you jumped in right away and said it's a revolution. Can you comment on why you think that? So why is this a dramatic shift and not a tinkering with? Why would you think that? So that focus on inquiry key, okay? Interesting. So lots of support. By the way, just as you are coming in, I sent out a tweet this morning. I think Susan responded to it, in which I noted, I was thinking recently, if kids began to see textbooks as sources of evidence rather than sources of answers, that they may interrogate them more. And what I meant by that, and I think it fits with your sense of revolution, I think too often textbooks are seen to hold answers, and the job of students is to retrieve the answers, to answer factual questions, to complete a worksheet, and so on. But imagine if students saw that simply as a collection of evidence. Could we get them to question, why did the authors decide to include this? Why isn't this mentioned? Why was that picture picked to go with this? Are there other ways we could have titled it? Like, I'm wondering if we got kids to see a textbook as simply one body of evidence and there are many more, could we shift the way students see history? Instead of facts to be retrieved, questions to be pondered and to be explored. So Oh, and also I like your comment, paring it down, trying to move away from the content laden approach that we've had in the past. Great. Scott, I wanted to comment, Scott. I think you made an interesting point. A revolution, but we only went halfway. I would tend to agree. We've got this push to inquiry, open it up. It's a bit of a tension, I think, that we have that we want to talk about tonight. There are still a lot of specific expectations. There still appears to be a lot of details or directions set out. And so finding the inquiry within a prescribed curriculum is a challenge. Notice we still do not have a curriculum that, as much as we might like to let kids explore their interest, like it or not, they're doing Confederation in grade 8. You know, they're doing there are issues that they are doing, and they may not have the interest. So, interesting point. Okay, great. This is. Okay, so I'm just reading through some final comments. All right, so many of you see this as a significant. Louise, could people? I love Louise's question. Does everyone feel this way, or the people here tonight who? Your sense in your buildings with your colleagues, is it being approached as a dramatic departure from what we've done, or is your sense that there's still a lot of traditional practice going on? Okay, interesting. All right, I'm going to move along. These are great comments. Thanks so much. So one of the reasons I asked the question about your interest tonight and why you joined this session, I'm wondering to what degree teachers' willingness to jump in through inquiry is dependent on teachers' own understanding of inquiry. Is part of the issue at times, I'm not sure how to implement an inquiry approach, and so I'll stay with what's safe. So I'm wondering about, so I see, Debbie, that teachers are looking for a PD in the area to help them make the transition, but there's still a sense. And that's going to come back in a bit. I want to talk about concerns about inquiry. Okay, I want to just pick up before we move on, and well, no, you know what, we'll come back to this in a bit. I think we should dig in. So, I just did a quick summary, and we can provide any of this to you. I'm sure Susan can help me figure out how we could send it out to people. This is my at a glance sheet for what's changing. At a glance summary of what the heritage and citizenship strands are about. Some important information about what's different about it, and some issues to consider in creating an inclusive classroom. So part of this is just to highlight. Grade 1, 2 in the heritage and citizenship, really not that different. Minor changes, some of the details, but the topics aren't dramatically different. Communities in Canada, 1780 to 1850, we've had a bit of an evolution from the pioneer unit of 10 or 15 years ago to early settler communities, with a focus, notice, on settler communities in the last curriculum, now to communities in Canada. And you'll notice the intent here is to be looking at a variety of communities, including First Nations, African Canadian Jewish communities, and so on. I've put a note on the side of some things to be careful of. I would argue that one of the big challenges, at least so far, and what I've heard from teachers, is the inclusiveness is wonderful. Finding age-appropriate, grade-appropriate material is the challenge right now. That there is materials on the diverse communities, it's just often not at a grade 3 level. So that seems to be one of the issues. TV Ontario asked me to meet with them, and when they asked what could they do to help teachers, I said, well, we need to get material out that's age-appropriate, so hopefully they're responding. Okay, so time I'm seeing is an issue. So, and then the big change in this curriculum is, the grade 4, where the former grade 5 ancient civilizations has been backed up to 4, blended with the medieval. I think it's a bit of a massive stretch, and the sad point for me, if I were to have a criticism of this curriculum, we've reduced to grade 4 as the only year our children get any world history until grade 11, and probably 95% of students don't take grade 11 world history. So in an increasingly globalized world, I do find it a bit disturbing that we've reduced to one strand, that most of our kids will graduate high school, and the only world history they will have ever taken is now down to one strand. I personally find that a bit disturbing. I don't know if others feel the same way. It seems like a massive amount of material. I put a couple of notes on the side. You can read through those. Just want to quickly summarize a few other pieces. Grade 5, as you will probably all be aware, really is the former grade 7, or the first strand. So grade 7 has been reduced down to 2 strands, and really the first strand was dropped back into 5, First Nations and Europeans. Again, I don't know how much material that you have. TC Squared does have a document we'd written a number of years ago, Early Contact in New France, which is a pretty good fit that can be helpful. Although I think it may only be available digitally now if you need it. Grade 6, I think this is a course that people find interesting. I find it a bit bizarre. There's no content in the new grade 6 that isn't covered somewhere already in grade 3, 5, 7, 8, 10, that all of this material is covered, but they've kind of packaged it around identity. I kind of wish they'd have given us a little breathing space to allow a little more inquiry and not added another, but that's what it is. Yeah, interesting point about what is Canada. Yeah. Okay, so trying to keep up with all your comments is tough. They're great comments. Ian, I would agree. The content, it spans several years. It just has you drop in and touch on, and it's tough. Yeah, sorry, I'm just reading the other comment, James. Good point. I mean, I think we all knew medieval wouldn't last. It was a very Eurocentric. I kind of wish that we had 2 years, though, if we're going to do justice to global civilizations, that we didn't try to cram it into one strand in 1 year. It seems like an awful lot to cover. By the way, the other thing to keep in mind, the new civilizations, the grade 4, in the past, the curriculum was designed in such a way that we typically would look at, ancient Egypt and then do a unit on China, or perhaps a unit on Greece or whatever it might be. The new curriculum is very much more thematically oriented, so we might look at how early societies were governed, and you would compare, and then you might look at how early societies use innovations to thrive in their environment or something like that. And again, you would look around the world at different innovations. So it's kind of moved away from a unit on an ancient civilization to themes of ancient civilization. So I don't want to belabor this too much. I want to get to some practical pieces here. The other side, the Canada and world connections, again, grades 1 and 2, not that different. Shifting grade 3 away from urban and rural to living and working in Ontario, and looking at land use and so on. Political and physical regions, not hugely different. The government piece in 5. I mean, there are changes within, but the structuring overall, not that big. So let me ask you, I'll go back to from a content lens, because what I've, earlier I was asking in terms of the approach, and there was lots and lots of conversation around inquiry as being a fairly revolutionary approach. Would you argue that the content, and I've given my 2 cents worth on some of the shifts and things I like and things I'm a bit concerned about. Do you think we've tinkered with the content or dramatically revised the way we're approaching the content? So James has made some comments about the attempt to move it from a Eurocentric How well have we done with that? Have we created a more culturally responsive, more inclusive curriculum? Have we made some moves in the right direction but not dramatic? What do you think? So again, renovation, tinkering with, or revolution, dramatic changes in the content this time. And James, thanks for that comment. It's, I think, a very important point, and it was in one of the pages I showed earlier, the framing around big ideas or broad conceptual ideas, and then having students select information that they want to test that out. Okay, great. So as the comments come in, I'm going to try to keep an eye on them, but I want to move us to, I want to pause for a moment. And I sense tonight a fairly positive vibe around inquiry and the potential. I'd like you, if you wouldn't mind, to just, and you can do it on, Susan maybe can come on and remind us which tool you can use to type it right on the box, or you can type it in the chat window. I'm curious, what do you see as the opportunities, challenges, and what do you wonder about in teaching through inquiry? So what are the opportunities it gives to, what would you say the pluses, what am I excited about, what challenges do you face in teaching through an inquiry approach? And the others, I'm not sure it's a positive or a negative, but I wonder, what would you wonder about? So again, I'm just going to pause, and if Susan wouldn't mind just reminding you how, if you want to put this right on the screen, that would be wonderful. And I'll turn off my mic for a moment just as you populate the screen or the chat box.
So as Garfield said, you can put this in the chat box, but it would be very nice if you used the text tool. So just to the left of your whiteboard, there's a toolbar, and you can see the text tool with a big A on it, and it will just give you a little text box, and you can put your responses into the 3 columns as Garfield outlined.
So I have to rejoin by just saying, wow, I've asked questions like this in past sessions, and I don't think I've ever seen such a rich populating of the screen. Well done. And it's interesting to note that with all of our excitement of an inquiry, we've got quite a few challenges in the middle, and I'm hoping to start to address some of those. I want to begin by saying one of the challenges, and I see some of you saying, loss of control, assessment issues. So let me just, a couple of things if I could. Inquiry has not had the impact that we have hoped over the years. When you look at the research in John Hattie's book on visible learning, found that inquiry, in fact, did not have the payoff that he thought it would, and it was actually coming under the cutoff of having an impact for kids. And for those of us who work in the field of critical thinking and inquiry, it's a bit surprising and if not somewhat disturbing. And so we begin to look at, so what's going on here? Just another piece, and I'll begin to answer that. In Alberta, for a number of years, 2 or 3 years ago, they were hitting down a pretty hardcore individualized learning, inquiry kind of approach. And they began to notice that their scores on the provincial exams declined consistently, especially in math, over about a 5-year period. You may be aware that Alberta has some of the highest international test scores, very proud of their education system, and yet with inquiry driving it, they were heading the wrong way. And so the former Premier Prentice was threatening to pull the plug on inquiry and return to the basics. And so this raised some red flags for us. But by the way, I want you to notice the dichotomy that immediately emerges. Because the complaint was, and in fact I'm going to Alberta again, I've been there every week for the last 3 weeks, and I'm returning this week, and I'm told sometimes, be careful how much you use inquiry, it's become a dirty word in Alberta. Why? Teachers felt kids weren't learning the basics. Now, notice the tension. There's a belief that we either can teach through inquiry or we can teach kids the basics, but we make a choice. The pendulum tends to swing, and so I see a similar, will you have enough content knowledge? So will kids learn the basics they need to know if I engage them in inquiry? So we embrace inquiry because we realize memorizing information isn't engaging and there's not a lot of depth. And then we begin to say, oh no, but kids don't have any content, they don't know their basics, and we swing back away. And we have this pendulum swinging. I want to suggest to you that we should stop the pendulum swing and recognize that you can teach the basics through an inquiry approach. And if you're interested in more of this, we published an article, I think last month, in Canadian Education on the basics and inquiry. And so, Maria, just as you said, inquiry and basics aren't mutually exclusive. You're absolutely, that was the essence of our article, to show we can increase student scores, we can build basic numeracy, basic literacy, basic understanding of Canadian history and geography. You can do that through an inquiry approach, but we have to properly understand inquiry. I did see something tweeted out the other day. Yeah, it's the basics and inquiry in Canadian education. As I'm chatting, I bet you Susan will probably find it and throw up a link for you. And if not, I'll find a way to do that. So what I wanted to say to you is so we have this dichotomy that we want to be careful of, because there's no reason we can't get kids to engage in inquiry, but we have to define it. I saw, and I'm going to take issue with this, I saw a tweet the other day in which someone said, you know, teachers' job is to inspire kids and then get out of the way. And I want to say to you, I have grave concerns about our belief that our job is simply to inspire kids and get out of the way. James, let me come back to your question just a second. I don't agree that my job is to inspire kids and get out of the way, because I think my kids could draw inspiration from a lot of sources that don't require a teacher. And if you're just going to get out of the way, how do we justify our salaries? I would argue, and I think I sent a tweet out this morning in this saying, that my job is to inspire kids and then build the intellectual tools they need so they can engage in meaningful inquiry. My job is not to teach the answers. It's not to teach the content. But my job is to equip kids with the intellectual tools that they need so that the inquiry they do has depth and has meaning to it. So I want to be careful that we don't see inquiry as just like kids wonder and away they go. We will delve into that a bit more. James, let me just respond to your question. First of all, the priority of math in so many areas has, like, when their marks decline, boom, they get concerned. Historica, about 2 weeks ago, released a report card on curriculum across Canada. Alberta scored the lowest, and Historica's complaint was the absence of good, solid historical content, I suppose. Alberta's curriculum is much more organized around themes. Grade 10 is globalization. Grade 11 is nationalism. So it's a much more thematic and conceptual approach than our kind of chronological grade 10, 20th century world history. There was some pushback when they released that curriculum that kids weren't learning enough, hardcore Canadian history. And in fact, they introduced a new course which was optional, but was just, basic historical facts. I don't think anyone's taking it, but the questions still get raised. So, again, I'm just looking. I think the tension we've come up against, and I see some of you typing this, in the digital world, it's hard to justify our salaries and our jobs if it's content transmission. The Khan Academy can do that, and Googling can do that. Siri can answer those questions. It just strikes me as hard to justify our role if we think content delivery. There are much more efficient ways. But it does strike me as still that inquiry still requires us to teach the tools, and we'll get into what that means. Susan, the inquiry-based learning, the inspiring education is the document that is essentially up in tatters now. Excuse the phrase, the poop hit the fan on this one, and there's a lot of backpedaling going on. Inspiring education, it's not being talked about anymore. So the report you had is what we had to respond to in writing our document. By the way, our paper was to be sent to the Premier's office to say you don't have to give up on inquiry to teach kids basics, and to make sure that they didn't suddenly make an about face. Okay, so boy, I got to say, after tonight's session, get a hold of this. Just take time to read all these comments. This is rich stuff. I'm trying to read it and talk. There you go. That's Crystal. You've got the article, the education basics and inquiry. That's it. Actually, Susan, what you posted is worth taking a look at. It's a road that Alberta tried going down and kind of quickly abandoned because it wasn't working, and I think it's instructive for us to think about. So I've been touching on what I would call education's dichotomous relationship with inquiry. And many of these have come up, so I'll touch on it quickly. Many of you cited, why should we embrace inquiry? It increases student engagement. Kids are more interested in looking up and filling in worksheets. I think many of you touched on its relevance, that there's the potential to increase relevance, that it can foster deeper understanding, connections and cross-curricular opportunities, more collaboration, more reflection and metacognition. So what are the challenges that I've seen? And you, again, touched on many of these. Inquiry is still grounded in curriculum, not just student interest. So as much as we might want to say kids inquire into what they want, well, to a degree, we still have a curriculum that defines, that they will do early settler communities, or that they will look at these civic issues and so on. So we have to frame the inquiry within a curriculum. Kindergarten less so. Kindergarten is very much play-based and follow what the kids express an interest. Our social studies, we do have to ground it in curriculum. If we don't, and Louise, I'm so glad you said that, curriculum content has to be addressed. Our kids cannot explore in a meaningful way if they have no background, if they don't have some context. We need to help them do that. One of the dangers we're seeing in inquiry is kids simply becoming overwhelmed. If we haven't built the intellectual tools, we just say, this is why I said I'm worried about this notion that inspire kids and get out of the way. Many of our children, when you get out of the way, just become lost and overwhelmed. Too much information, don't know what to do with it, can't organize it, haven't been given the thinking strategies and so on. And if I don't have foundational content, then I don't know what I don't know. It's hard to inquire into something I didn't know about. I would argue, and I'll pull this up in the next, absolutely, and that certain schools, they are the foundation. My job is to create a level playing field so that kids can engage with the inquiry, or to build some background. I've put up here, from the bottom one you see on the right is John Hattie's research, and the green reflects when he looked at, now he's up to 1,300 studies he's looked at, condensed all the research around different approaches to learning, not just inquiry. What he found is that it scored a 0.31. 0.4, this is measuring effect size on learning, or gains in learning. inquiry-based teaching did not have the impact that that he's hoped, but we touched on that. So I want to begin to address, how do we ensure we're getting the payoff that we want? First of all, you'll notice, so if I just back up, inquiry-based teaching, some people are referring to IBL, inquiry-based learning. That is a particular approach. I want to suggest to you that it may be more useful if we see inquiry as a disposition.
Garfield, did you intend to turn your mic off? Okay, so Garfield left the main room, so it looks like Garfield got kicked out of the session. So I think he was about to start reading this screen, so I'm sure you can be reading it to yourself. If he doesn't get in another minute, I'll advance it to the next slide. There he is.
Well,
welcome back, Garfield.
I watch as others sometimes come and leave the room, and you left the room.
That was quick.
Okay, so I hope my internet doesn't keep doing that. Okay, I'm going to watch that. So I'll just quickly move along. So how do we get there? We need to teach both content and discipline knowledge. So we need to build some background knowledge, but not just about content. If I want to develop a conceptual understanding, kids need to understand how do we engage as a geographer, as a historian. What's at the core of the discipline? We need to nurture the disposition to inquire, and so I'm linking back to one, by making sure every day I teach in a way that invites kids to think to learn and learn to think. That's a phrase we use in our new book on creating thinking classrooms, that our goal should be that, first of all, we know from the research the most powerful learning kids do is when they're engaged in thinking about what they're learning about. But that also means we have to teach kids how to learn to think. So if they don't have those tools, it's less powerful. So what we want to do, by the way, the reason I'm making this point, we can invite inquiry, but if we have several lessons to build foundations, build content knowledge that is still transmissive, we're still creating a climate in the classroom that is essentially sit tight while I transmit stuff, and then we can get to the inquiry. And I want to say, no. Every single day you walk into my class, thinking's at the core of what we do. It's simply how we operate here. So even if it's a content delivery lesson, thinking will drive this lesson. We want to frame around opportunities, I'll show you in a little bit, that allow kids to right off the bat begin with a prediction, a speculation, an initial thought, and then we want to sustain that inquiry. We want to invite kids right off the bat. A question I was dealing with a student today, for example, who benefited most from early contact, First Nations or Europeans? And we give kids a dashboard with a dial, and they can either set it at Europeans where they benefited by far the most, more the Europeans than First Nations. No, I think more Europeans than First Nations, more First Nations than Europeans. No, more First Nations. Remember, this is early contact. Kids set the dial. It's my diagnostic baseline. What do you think? What beliefs are you bringing in? What evidence might you have already? As we learn every day, as we explore, we look at, do you want to change your dial? Do you think we should shift it more one way or the other? What evidence do you have? If you're certain you should leave the dial where it is, what evidence do you have to support that position? That would give you a better answer. But notice, I want to begin learning with a launch that invites kids right off the bat to weigh in, to start thinking. We were doing this today, and a student asked me about science and electricity. I think it was grade 6. And it was my social studies class. But I said, ask kids, if your city wants to find an alternative way to generate electricity, should they invest in geothermal, wind, solar, what was the fourth one we gave them? Can't remember. Geothermal, wind, and so on. Let kids start by picking one and say, well, I think this one because why? As we explore, and then by the way, we had them doing an OCI like you just did, the opportunities, challenges. As they explore, did you change your mind and so on? But it's the driver, you see. And then metacognition, by letting kids fail forward. Okay, is it my idea working? I'll show you more of this in a moment. But notice if I invite kids to weigh in early on, then the metacognitive part is just natural to the lesson. What does the new things that we've uncovered today or explored or talked about, how does that impact your answer? Do you think your answer still works? Would you like to change it? So you see, these are ways we can do that. So, by the way, don't you love this picture? This is one of my favorite pictures. I think schools need to become, as you can see here in my statement, sources of awe and wonder for students. And this is what many of you want. We need to frame curriculum in a way that gets kids interested. I want to touch on that a little bit. And part of that, in my view, and sorry, this is meant to come up in different stages, I'm going to, and some of you heard me present before will have heard me say this, I'm going to challenge Bloom's taxonomy, and I'm going to suggest to you that the very way that we are excited this evening about teaching through inquiry has been inhibited by Bloom's taxonomy. And yet I suspect almost all of you learned about Bloom's taxonomy in your teacher training. Could I just see, with a check mark, how many of you remember learning about Bloom's taxonomy in your teacher training? So, I see the counter going up at the first assignment. And you were probably told, and by the way, I want you to think about this. Use Bloom's taxonomy to create your questions. Almost every textbook I know begin with knowledge questions and work to the thinking questions. If you happen to know the high school curriculum, grade 10 applied and academic, same content, we just change the verb so that the applied actually have to think, they analyze and assess. And every single overall expectation in the applied is to describe. Look to our achievement chart. We separate knowledge and understanding from thinking. I would love if someone could ever tell me how you possibly demonstrate understanding in the absence of thinking, because I don't know how to do it. I don't know how children apply their learning. I don't know how they get to the application without thinking. Notice what we've done in our achievement chart is we've isolated thinking as a separate competency, and yet it underpins all of them. But that's the ghost of Bloom, you see, that we start at the bottom with knowledge, we impart knowledge to kids, then we'll work on their comprehension, and at the pinnacle, at the top, is an invitation to evaluate, synthesize, or in the new version of Bloom, to create. But notice it's the pinnacle, it's the result when you get to the top. I want to argue, by the way, I'm not saying flip it upside down. I'm saying there's not a thing on Bloom's taxonomy that couldn't be an invitation to think. It's the flawed assumption. Kids should be filtering. What knowledge? I'm going to tell you 10 facts. I want you to decide which 6 are most helpful in solving our problem. So notice basic content delivery can be done in a way that invites kids to think. I'm going to give you a title. I think this title's boring. Can you come up with a more interesting title after reading the section? These are small little daily things that I can do that puts thinking at the core of learning, even if I'm teaching a content lesson. So instead of seeing content delivery as the starting point and then thinking as the ending point, I'm proposing that thinking be the starting point and it runs through. It's what we do every day. It's simply how we teach. And I want to layer in one other piece that this is just something I've been playing with lately. And so I'll do it quickly, and any comments would be helpful because I might write this up if there seems to be value in that. I've been playing with the notion of moving from what I'm calling fake to real. And I'm doing this in the context of what I call degrees of authenticity. So you'll notice my bottom left quadrant would be my fake quadrant. There are two continuum. One, from fake to real product or performance. So fake performance are the type of things that we make kids do in school that they won't do after that. So in some cases, writing the kind of reports they do, taking a test. These are things that we do in school, and many of us try to find more real or authentic tasks that kids do that simulate or are in fact grounded in the real world. But my other continuum up the left side there is, who's the purpose or audience? Can we move from fake to real? So teacher or class, kids create these beautiful models, wonderful presentations, and they present to each other. That strikes me as a bit fake. Like, imagine if I could get kids to have authentic audiences that matter. And by the way, it's not to say teachers or their classmates don't matter, but what if the kids knew that you have an audience beyond the classroom? So notice, I think there are times that we have what I would call, notice, fake real. So the product of performance is real, or sorry, the product of performance is real, but I still don't have an audience that's real. Or I go the other direction. That's a really interesting task. Historic affairs, some of you may have had your kids participate in. There's a real audience. You're going to take your display, and other people will come and see it, and you want to do your best for that. The problem is many history fair assignments are assembling information and sticking them on a board. Imagine, though, if we said to kids, something like, the current Minister of Finance thinks there should be more women on our money. I want you to build a compelling argument and present it at a history fair about a woman or a group of women who should be highlighted on our money. Like, what if we gave it a purpose? So you've already got the audience. I just need a richer purpose. Or the other side, I might have kids, I don't know, doing something where they write a report about first contact, or I could say, I want you to simulate, I want you to write a piece of historical fiction imagining first contact through the lens of two different groups. Like, what if we began to, exactly, sorry, I'm just saying exactly. If they're engaged in something they're passionate about, and if I can give them an audience. Watch young kids if you say, and tomorrow we have 3 guests joining us for your presentations. Boom, their engagement goes up. So I think there are 2 routes to increasing student engagement. One is giving them tasks that they see value in doing, they're interested in doing, that they see that. Give them an audience as well. That's the other thing to think about. Let me give you a real quick, I love this example, sorry. Create posters for tourism for local identity. Now, Marianne, I'd love to know, because I think that's a great authentic task along the bottom, if those posters are handed in, marked, and handed back to students, it would fit, for me, around fake real. But if those posters are, in fact, shared publicly somehow, then it bumps up to real. I was sharing this with someone who said, just got an idea. My grade 5s are about to do a novel study. Each chapter, they write a summary or their response to it. And then he began to think, but if I had them blogging about this, to other children their age and about this book and about why they should read it or something. He said, all of a sudden I've got an authentic audience. It's not just me marking it. Boom, it bumps up to real. Grade 2. I want you to think about, if you have a chance, check out Kiva. Sorry, I should have put in it's kiva.org. Kiva is a micro-lending site. People around the world look for small loans of $200, maybe $5,000 to buy material, to be able to make items to sell at a local market in Peru, to buy implements to help their market garden, or whatever it may be. You can loan in increments of $25. Okay, people who need it. By the way, 98.7% last time I checked. About 98.7% of these loans are repaid in somewhere, might be 3-4 months, might be 2 years. That's written up on the site. Imagine if your grade 2 kids looking at communities around the world, move this into the real by saying, we're going to select someone who we think we should support, we'd like to support. We're going to read some of their ideas. We want to learn about the country that they live in so we can know more about where we're lending. We're going to use our visual arts to create crafts that we could sell to raise the money. We're going to use our math. I mean, it strikes me that we could do so much interesting inquiry using kiva.org that would be so real for kids that it's not write me a report about a country, it's learn about this country because we're going to invest there, or go do research in different countries kids come back. Anyway, some thoughts about Kiva as a possible. The other thing to think about, if you haven't seen, Worldviews, let's put this in here, is a website created by a teacher in Kitchener-Waterloo to help connect kids around the world. So grade 6, I've been thinking about, or grade 2, post questions, grade 6 identity. Imagine if kids had to generate questions that they could ask other people in the world about what they think it means to be Canadian. So instead of us trying to define our identity, what if we floated out questions and kids who are involved in the Worldviews website around the world can respond back, and the kids can check in every once in a while and see. Beautiful. Love this, the research with organizations. So I think the more we can have kids engaged in tasks that they see as authentic, with audiences they see as authentic, we can increase engagement. I was hinting at earlier, and I want to touch on this just for a moment. And what I want to argue for this evening, and I'm going to get into a few more details, is guided wonder versus aimless wonder. And what I mean by that is I think we have to be careful that inquiry does not become kids just doing whatever they're interested in doing, but we don't, this is the aimless wonder is teachers get out of the way. I would say no, guided wonder is what we want. By the way, notice I'm not saying directed wonder. So directed wonder is when I pose the questions, I pick the topics, and I invite you to wonder about things that I've defined. And by the way, I think there's value, there's power in that. It often is necessary given our curriculum that I may have pre-selected the question or pre-selected the topic. But guided wonder is when we invite kids to pick an area of interest. But when I say guided, I'm not guiding you to an answer. I'm guiding you through tool development, right? I want to guide you in terms of how do we ask powerful questions. What criteria might help you make that decision? What thinking strategy is going to help you organize and make sense of what you found? Like guided wonder to me is being that support. And I would argue, by the way, we're not sage on the stage, but we're also not just a guide on the side. I use the term that teachers are choreographers. That our job is to choreograph the learning kids need to help them engage in that meaningful inquiry. That my job is to know, and when someone said earlier, all kids aren't coming in with the same background. That's why my job is to choreograph the learning. I know when I need a whole group, or, whole class, teacher-directed foundation piece, when it's small group, when it's individual, when to step in and teach a thinking strategy. Like, to me, these are important questions teachers make in guided wonder. We choreograph the learning that will move kids along their learning journey. So I'm just going to touch on this because I think many of you will be familiar with T.C. Squared's work in critical thinking, and some of you may not. So I'm just going to put a couple of pieces up real quick to bridge us into the next piece. So critical thinking at its core, notice there has to be an invitation to assess or judge. So I made a comment earlier that not all of the questions the ministry asks in the curriculum are in fact good inquiry questions. If they don't invite kids to render a judgment of some kind, then it's not really an inquiry question. If I can go look it up, if I can retrieve that from the textbook, from my notes, if I can just Google that answer, it's not a critical thinking question. Or if the question directs me to what I'm supposed to believe. How has our government made effective use of policies to create an inclusive country? Well, notice you've given me the answer. That you're telling me that the government has been effective, and I'm to list the ways they've been effective. That's not a critical thinking question. How effective has the government been? Would be. It would allow me to say, well, I think they've been somewhat ineffective. So a great comment here in the inquiry process, that a question to prove, disprove, wonderful. Notice if you're telling me what to believe, what makes our democracy effective? And that's not really an inquiry question because you've told me the answer and now I'm to list some things. So these are, you'll see at the bottom, 4 attributes we'd look for in a good critical thinking question. Does it give kids options, possibilities, or choices to consider? Does it require they make a decision or a judgment of some kind? Do they need to use criteria to assess or judge and not just be a gut reaction or how they feel? Does it promote the use of evidence to support that judgment? Those are 4 things that we need to be thinking about when we frame our question. Are kids either being asked to make a decision using criteria and evidence, and are there choices for them to consider? And these are, again, if you're not familiar with our work, these are 6 ways that we can frame invitations to think critically. So as you're trying to look at the inquiry, what do we want kids to inquire into? We can have kids decode. So we give them an image, and they have to attempt to explain what's happening in the image. We ask kids to understand, what do you think is the main idea in the story, in this fable? They have to decode if they're looking for themes or main ideas. When we critique, we ask kids, was this character heroic? Was this a fair way to treat people? Is our democracy effective? Those are critique. When we judge, Which was more effective, Athenian democracy or Canada's democracy? Well, what would make an effective democracy? Kids would weigh that and pick the one. Which of these two characters, grade 1 community, which of these two characters showed that they were good friends to others? Right? Rework the piece. If you're familiar with classic example for grade 5 is Jane Yolen's book, Encounters. Some of you are, I'm sure, are familiar with. Jane Yolen's book, Encounters, is the story of a young Taino boy in the Caribbean who sees the arrival of Columbus's ships. He sees them as monsters on the sea. And the story is the arrival through the eyes of this young Taino boy on the impact of the arrival of Columbus and the Europeans. And at the end of the book, the young boy is now a 7-year-old man reflecting back on the consequences and impact of the European arrival. A rework the piece would be if we said that we read that to kids, we talked about the impact of the encounter of Europeans on indigenous cultures, and then we asked kids to write the Canadian version. Let's take a look at writing, reworking this from a Canadian lens. So it's Cartier's arrival. It's early European arrival into North America. Oh, sorry, I'm just reading, James. You are absolutely right. The challenge is the driver. You're absolutely right. It's the theme that drives the learning. So important. It's not the end. So when I'm talking about this, notice it's not kids. Now that we've learned all about Cartier, write me a story. It's you're going to write me a story. And every time we learn about something, we're going to pause and add to our story and flesh it out. James, thanks so much for pointing that out. Rework the piece. Rewrite the story in a different context. Take your textbook. Change the perspective. How would it sound different? Perform the specs. If you're to present your story to more and you want to read it in a way that is convincing, what intonation, gestures, and so on would you use? So note, perform the specs is, sorry, that my description's wrong. It's not creating a product. I've got them flipped. It's performing following a set of criteria. And design the specs would be write me the story. I've put some notes on the bottom that when you're framing criteria to support kids, if we understand the nature of the task, it helps us align the nature of the criteria. So that's just to help a little bit, and I'll watch our time. If you haven't seen a presentation with TC Squared, I'll very quickly touch on. On the left, you'll notice those questions. Maybe I could just get a few just to type in a couple. What do you notice about all the questions on the left? Just maybe type a word or two while I take a quick sip of water. So what do you notice about all the questions on the left of this table? Okay, they're closed questions, they're knowledge, they're recall, they're list. Okay, we would call these are all retrieval questions. Notice there's no judgment to be made. What about when we move to type 2 questions? What do you notice about all my type 2 questions? Okay, so it's interesting you're saying an opinion. It's personal. Notice I do need to make a decision now, but how do I make that decision? And so you notice when it said personal, it's not based on evidence and criteria. This is gut. This is a preference question. It's how I feel about something. Notice when you move to type 3, these are judgment questions. So both type 2 and type 3 require that I make a decision, but type 3 requires that I'm able to defend that decision using evidence and criteria to back it up. Whereas type 2 only requires, do you like chocolate or vanilla ice cream? I like chocolate. Why? I don't know. It tastes good. Okay? Whereas type 3, why would Rockville be better than Maryland to meet your family? Well, what are your family's needs? What criteria would you use? So what we want to do is be tweaking our questions to make sure that we're inviting kids to make a thoughtful decision. Let me show you just a couple of quick examples. By the way, this is going back to Bloom and saying, no, be careful, because Bloom had us believe that the verb is what's the key. So we ask kids, we change the verb, it changes the question. List 4 battles Canadians participated in World War I. Notice that's a list question. Assemble evidence about the infusion of technology in classrooms. Okay? Often we assume that, well, they're just gathering information, it's not a judgment. Add a title to your story. Okay, my story. List 4 significant battles Canadians participated in. Notice it's still a list question, but by adding a qualifier, Kids now have to make a decision. I didn't ask you to list any 4 battles or the first 4 battles you came across or your favorite 4 battles, right? What I want you to see here is by adding the word significant, kids now have to think about, well, I picked these because these are the criteria for a significant battle. It's not assemble any evidence. Biggest problem I hear from teachers, kids just copying and pasting, right? Instead, assemble credible and relevant evidence. What's your criteria for a credible source or relevant evidence? What would make an effective title? Add an effective title to your story, not just any title. So notice it's not whether I have list, identify, describe. Describe in a way that others could imagine this situation is a critical thinking task. It's the qualifier that we add. These are, in our book on creating thinking classrooms, these are the 4 areas that we think are important if we're going to promote thinking and inquiry in the classroom. Create the climate. If kids sense in the class, and James' point earlier was really important on this, if I tell kids you're going to be doing a project and it comes after I load the content, in other words, if my experience in class day to day is one that has me feeling like teachers hold the answers and they feed them to us, when you get to the end and say, now create your own product, kids are going to keep coming to us, have I done it right? Is this what you want? Because they see us as holding the answers. We need to create the climate where kids are willing to take chances, to question, to wonder. We need to create rich opportunities that invite that. And earlier tonight I was talking about we have to build their capacity to think. And by building their capacity, these are the 5 intellectual tools. Do they have sufficient background that they're either bringing to my class, that I'm helping them develop, or they're able to find and build as part of their inquiry? But do they have the background that allows them to make a thoughtful decision? Have they thought about the criteria they might use that would help them make that decision? Do they understand the language of thinking? Do they know what an inference is? Do they know what it means to appreciate? Do they know what a clue versus evidence is? And do they know what a guess is versus a prediction? Have we equipped them with some thinking strategies that will help them? Are we nurturing the habits of good thinkers, that they persevere, they pay attention to detail, they're empathetic, and so on? And lastly, is our assessment practice providing them the guidance that will support their thinking, not just justify our marking, but in fact help them move forward in their thinking? So we act as that choreographer. When I've been touching on criteria, I want to just touch on a couple of key things. Notice there are 2 different types of criteria. There's what we would call descriptive criteria, and I'm just going to pull a couple of names. I'm going to try this anyway. Ian 3, I see here. Ian 3, can you run for President of the United States? Just wait for Ian's answer. Good point. So by the way, notice Ian's pointing out, and so I'm assuming you were not born in the U.S. To run for President of the United States, I believe you have to be a minimum 35 years old, American citizen, and in fact a natural born, as you point out. In fact, this was the debate with Ted Cruz, because he was born in Calgary. Technically, he's probably not eligible to run if they want to hang him up on that. According to the American Constitution, 3 criteria: at least 35 years old, American citizen who was naturally born in the U.S. Okay, those are 3 criteria. Ian, have we made a judgment about your leadership qualities? Okay. Now, by the way, as Ian's answering, I want you to note, I mean, obviously not. Descriptive criteria is not about the qualities. It's simply about what's required. So when we give kids a task and we say, and you must have 3 arguments, fine, I'll have 3 arguments, but are they any good? And you may find at times that when we describe our criteria in descriptive terms, we get a lot of kids meeting the criteria, and yet it's not really good work. So notice what I want to do is note qualitative criteria is a different type of criteria. Tell me if you could, and just see if a few of you could throw some thoughts up. What would you look for in an effective leader? I mean, this is timely. Tonight, I believe, is the New Hampshire primary. If you had a chance to vote, what are you looking for in an effective leader? just throw up a couple of comments about what do you look for in effective leadership. Someone who's inclusive in their policies and their vision. Okay, great. What else? What else do you want in an effective leader? Effective communicator. Great. Okay, what else you want? I want someone who's inclusive, open-minded, good orator, effective communicator, great hair, honest. By the way, notice you're talking about qualities now. And when we talk, notice when I had my slide up about critical thinking and intellectual tools, we talk about criteria for judgment. If I said to you, can you run for president? You said, no, I wasn't born in the U.S. There's no thinking involved. You can't run. I didn't have to think that one through. So notice when we work with kids, by the way, success criteria should involve both of these. But we need to let kids know this is what I'm looking for in the task. When you create my poster, I want a title, I want three images, and I want a caption with each image. You come in with your poster, it's got 2 images and 2 captions and no title. See, I wouldn't say, oh, that's a level 2. I'd simply say, you're not finished. You haven't met my basic descriptive criteria. When you've assembled them, I can give you some feedback. Now I want to look at, but are your images provocative? Are they eye-catching? Are your captions accurate? Are they informative? Do they focus on important ideas? Notice those are qualities that I look for. So in critical thinking, we're interested in the qualitative criteria, the pieces that help kids think through. We put the focus on the quality of thinking, not on whether or not you had 3 arguments, 4 arguments, 5 arguments. By the way, you may have noticed, though, I'm saying if you want to tell kids, I expect 3 arguments at this, by grade 5, I expect you've got 3 arguments, then tell kids that. And if they haven't got 3 arguments, send them back to add this 3rd argument. But when I assess the mark, it's on the quality of the argument. So when we look at our criteria, we need to ask ourselves, what's the judgment kids are being asked? Are they being asked to decode, to judge, to critique? Remember, criteria are attributes. So if I ask, is Jack Sparrow a hero? Well, what's my hero? Someone who is selfless, courageous, and so on. What's your criteria? What would it look like? Give us examples and non-examples. What would it look like if this criteria was met? What would it look like if it wasn't met? Sometimes we want to generalize the criteria. So, well, Jack saved his friends and he helped others, so he was selfless. So we help kids generalize ideas around fewer pieces. I wanted to show you in terms of planning for inquiry, planning for critical inquiry. This is a sheet I created just to try to help us think through. I start from, on the left, just what topics coming up. Next week I'm doing this topic in my class. So some of these are framed as questions, but often in the curriculum you may just say, well, tomorrow we're going to start exploring communities, or we're going to look at this event. Okay. So how would I problematize that? How would I turn that into a critical thinking question? So if we're looking at communities, if our community was the happiest place on earth, what important things would it have? So I've problematized. Kids have to make a judgment. Notice now I need criteria. Well, what would your criteria be for a happiest place? Well, people would be helpful and caring. Everyone's needs are met. There are lots of fun activities, and it's a clean and beautiful natural environment. Those are things I could invite kids. How are we going to create the happiest place on earth? And we'd give them some criteria. And then we invite kids. So by the way, note step 1, take your topic and tweak it so it becomes an issue. We problematize it so there's a judgment for kids to make. We identify the criteria that will help kids make that decision. And then we think about what product or performance kids would do. So in this case, we were asking grade 1s to be an Imagineer. Write and illustrate a book that shows others what your happiest place would be like. And by the way, in this one, each day as kids looked at different aspects of community, they would create a 2-page spread, and they would build it over time. So going back to James's comment, notice the kids know up front, you're going to be writing a book about the happiest place. And every day we learn, every couple of days, we'll create 2 more pages that we will add and we'll polish them. Notice now I need criteria for an interesting book. So my first set of criteria were around the issue. My second set are around the product or performance. Right? So an interesting book should tell why it's a happy place to live, would have eye-catching pictures, the sentences make sense, and the writing uses descriptive words as an example. Let me know, is this helpful? And I'm just reading James' comment. Yeah, James, I 100% agree. I think this is exactly what we need to do, as you point out. The document gives us some, but it often they're still somewhat closed, or they direct kids to an answer, so we want to tweak them a bit. Okay, so by the way, look at my grade 3 example. How similar or different would life be in my community for someone moving here? By the way, I was developing this with some teachers in Alberta where they do Peru, India, Ukraine. Imagine if we asked kids, how similar or different would life be for a Syrian refugee moving to our community? Okay, so this is about kids thinking about, let's learn about what life is like, the climate, customs, and so on, and get kids to think about how similar or different, whether many or few differences, were they big or small. That's how I'll decide if there was a big difference or a small difference. I want you to prepare an informative guide for people moving into your community, and you have to explain to them what they're going to find that's similar and different from where they're coming from. So this would require children to learn about a country that people might be coming to Canada from. They'd learn about that country, they'd compare it to Canada, and they'd create a guide to say, well, when you get here, here are some things you should be prepared for that are going to be different, but here are things that you're going to find that may be similar. Notice my criteria now for an informative guide. It should explain important similarities and differences, have eye-catching pictures, so some similar pieces there. Yeah, I've got a variety of those that if I could share. I'm just thinking how I've done a variety of these for various grades across social studies. Just maybe Susan can help me think about how we could get them out to you. By the way, I just realized this slide is out of order. My apologies. Earlier, when I was saying to you, it's not the verb; it's the qualifier that matters. I want you to note what I started to do. Okay, Chris, let me answer that question in just a bit in terms of how many questions or problems, and I'll talk about how I'll structure it in just a few minutes, if that's okay. I started to create this, I call it a wheel of qualifiers. Earlier I talked to you about the 6 ways of framing critical thinking. We can critique or judge, we can rework, we can decode, design, perform. And so I just began to assemble the kind of qualifiers. Earlier when James said, we still need to tweak some of the ministry questions. You can take many of these qualifiers, drop them in, and boom, you've just tweaked your question into a critical thinking question. So instead of, assemble evidence about, assemble credible evidence. Identify 3 arguments the author makes in the text. Identify 3 compelling arguments the author makes in the text. Notice by adding that one word, I do 2 things. A, I require a judgment. Okay? I didn't ask for any arguments, I asked for compelling. B, I've highlighted where we need our criteria. Oh, what was my criteria for a compelling argument? That's going to guide students' thinking. Was it fair for the little red hen not to share her bread? How will children make that decision? Well, I give them a couple of criteria. What would it mean to be fair? What might that look like? Let's apply our criteria. Okay? Is this a sustainable way to produce energy for our community? What criteria might we use for sustainable? And kids have to make a judgment as they gather their evidence. So the idea of this wheel of qualifiers was just to provide a tool to teachers where very quickly I can take a question that I go, well, that's really just a list question. But if I drop in one of these terms, it may help me move it over to a critical thinking question. So just little tweaks so that when I'm asking questions, in part in response to Chris's question, every day I'm going to have a critical thinking question because I'm going to take questions I would have asked before and just tweak them with one of these. I don't have to rewrite my lesson significantly. I'm just dropping in a word that gets kids to think. So now, Chris, I'm going to get to the question that you asked. We're talking tonight about inquiry, but I want to propose that we think about what I would call sustained inquiry. So the difference being, I can walk in each day and have a new inquiry question, and every day in my class we inquire into something, but there's not a connective tissue. Kids don't see the link between yesterday and today or last week's and today's. And what we know from the research is that the power of inquiries, you can see by my statement here, is not the single question. It's the sequencing of questions that take kids deeper and deeper. The most powerful inquiry we're going to get kids into is when we have an overarching question that drives the unit, but each day we have a related question that's going to help them go deeper into that. So my earlier one, when I talked about science, which form of alternative energy would be the best? There's a number of things I need to unpack that are going to help kids to answer that. And so the next part I'm just going to quickly touch on was inspired for me by video games like these. Yeah, so I'm just reading some of the comments. Good point, Ian. I should add Minecraft to that. I don't think it has to be the same product, but again, here's my caution to teachers. I'm just responding to this question, critical thinking, same product or genre. If you're going to open up a wide range of possible products that kids create, keep in mind, I have an obligation to support kids. If I say you can create a bit strip cartoon, you can create a video, you can create, have I offered the support necessary, or am I confident enough that kids know how to use the editing suite, that they know how to use the software to manipulate, they know how to use the cartoon. The danger of something too open-ended is we may give kids tasks for which their content understanding is great, but they have no idea how to use the technology, they have no idea how to do the other piece. And I just want to say, we have to be kind to ourselves. I can only support so many different projects in a meaningful way. So I am sometimes worried about too open-ended a product and not being able to support kids in a way that they will be successful enough. So I suppose if I'm confident kids have that background themselves, they're free to do it. But yeah, that would be my response. So let me, I'm assuming many of you have played Angry Birds at some point or know of it. I'm just going to give you a little quick context for my work in sustained inquiry. And I was intrigued by Angry Birds, to be quite honest. I was doing some research for the book, and I found out that Angry Birds, at its height, was being played 200 million hours a year. Okay, 200 million hours a year around the world. So think of that. That's a lot of time of humans spent each year launching birds at these pigs. Right? 200 million hours per year. And I wondered, so what is it that game developers understand that teachers maybe need to pay attention to? And my answer came, I was presenting at a conference in Madrid, and the speaker before me was speaking on sustained attention. It was a brain research conference, and she was talking about how do we get at student motivation and sustained attention. And she pointed out that sustained attention connects to the pleasure center of the brain. This evening, you will pay attention to me if I'm saying something of value that's useful, that might be helpful, that seems interesting. But if not, you've probably checked out, at least mentally. That kids in our class, I don't see relevance, I don't see meaning, I don't see how I'll ever use this. It's hard to pay attention. Our pleasure center of our brain, we get a shot of dopamine, we have a sense of satisfaction, I want more of that. By the way, coffee is a dopamine booster. Okay? Chocolate is a dopamine booster. But notice what she pointed out, and this is what caught my attention. Being successful in achieving a challenge is a major source of dopamine. So when we accomplish something we've been striving towards, we get this rush, we get this, yes, I want to do that again. I suspect, well, that's why kinesthetic involvement matters, because yes, I can do that. If you've played Angry Birds, you'll know that they start with simple, like everyone is going to be successful at the beginning stages, and they keep ramping up the challenge. Why? Because if I'm successful but I'm not challenged, I get bored and quit. If I'm challenged beyond what I'm capable of, you don't get dopamine boost from repeated failure. So note the research suggests that we need to be successful minimum 20% of the time. Kids need to have enough chance that, okay, I've just got a new insight. This is why I realize it's so important that we give kids a chance to say, how would you design this? Which of these would you select? What do you think about this? And then we revisit it through our teaching, and they have their aha moments, they make new connections, they see things. This is why the inquiry needs to drive the learning, because that's how I'm going to hold your attention. Teaching content without purpose is much harder to hold kids' attention. And so I've been kind of hinting through this. I'll touch on it briefly. I want you to notice in education, we use terms like summative assessments and culminating activities. Notice both those terms suggest that the task is the end product of learning. It's the result of learning, right? See, I'd like to suggest to you that the task is not the end. It's not the culmination of the summation. It's the invitation. It's where we start. It's the purpose for doing the learning. That we need to flip around our traditional way of, at the end of the chapter, the texts have the interesting task. At the end of the unit, we give kids a project. I want to suggest to you that the task is the invitation, not the result. And this is where I talked earlier about teacher as choreographer, that if I set it up that way, my job now is to help you navigate through building the toolkit that you need. I'll just show you an example. It's a science example. Oh, great. Thanks, Louise. Here's a sample of something I was doing with grade 2s in an Ottawa class. And the question we were dealing with, grade 2 science, how can we best use our understanding of animals to help them with healthy lives? I want you to note, this was the first lesson I was asked to teach in the unit. 5 minutes into the first lesson, I asked kids to design, I gave them a task. You're going to be designing an enclosure to provide a healthy place for a baby animal to grow and live. Each child was given a particular animal. So one group, the elephants, the giraffe, the monkeys, the dolphins, and so on. We then gave kids what we call a thought book, handed them a little Hilberry book, said, draw me your enclosure right now, go. This is what one little boy drew. He was given the monkeys. This is his enclosure, 5 minutes into teaching, my diagnostic baseline to see what kids already know or don't know. That's what he drew. Notice we had set up this, so the earlier question, we have a driving question, overarching question, and then we have some lines of inquiry. For a few days, we want to explore what animals need to meet their physical needs, and then we want to think about the exercise they need, and then we want to think about what they need to eat to stay healthy and how we would handle them. The green, there were a series of lessons around physical handling. By the way, notice the evidence of learning, create a sketch, create some models, prepare a feeding guide. Each of those pieces are building blocks to go richer and deeper. This is what the little boy, same boy, drew a few days later. As they began to explore and look at, he was invited to go back into his thought book. Would you like to add any more details? Is there something you'd like to change? They did this several times in the units with richer and richer evidence. Okay? And then they built their models. But when I went back to visit the kids, they all wanted to show me their thought books first. They all want to walk me through their thinking. First I did this, but then we learned about this. And then I found this out. And their pages grew and grew and grew. And then they built their models. By the way, I love to show kids, this is J.K. Rowling planning out the Harry Potter series. I want them to see writing is messy. We change our mind, we move things around, we add things in. I want them to understand that thinking, inquiry is, you muck about. You try things, they don't always work. This is a page from Darwin's Origin of the Species early on. Okay? Look at them making notes, drawing, crossing out, adding details. Right? So getting kids to see it's okay to be messy, muck about. Inquiry is not clean, it's not linear, it's a very iterative process. And then earlier I had a question, we want to make inquiry routine. It's not the end. By the way, the other danger is we set the task up front. So when Chris asked the question, how often do you have an inquiry question? Every day in my class you'll be invited to think. Okay? So I want you to know that what's important, if I give a project up front and then I say, now, we're going to revisit that later, but sit tight while I teach content, I still haven't moved very far. I've just told them the project up front. But notice I haven't made thinking the routine part of learning. I've made it the start and I've made it the end, and that's another thing to be careful of. Oh, thanks for that note around the kids. They were wonderful. I'm watching my time. I have a couple of quick things I want to show you. When you're trying to develop overarching inquiries, I created this template just to help a little bit, where in the center I would place a ministry question, inquiry I'm going to use, and this is my criteria I test it with. Is that question or task going to invite kids to make a reasoned judgment? If it's not, how would I tweak it? Would it allow for it to invite kids to give an initial response, a tentative response that they can then affirm or refine as we learn? Does it allow for an iterative exploration so that we keep looping back? Could I come back to that question throughout the learning? It should transcend the particular. So is this question bigger than the particular event? Is this a question that that has legs, because good inquiry gives kids insights into life more generally. Is it generative? Will it create more questions kids wonder about? And is it arguable, debatable? And by the way, the reason we had it generalizable was for math, because often math, I can't argue it, but we want kids to generalize it. We want kids to be able to say, so what are you noticing that might help you check for reasonableness in an answer? By the way, if you were to plug in a question from the ministry and find, oh, it's not so good, I've been putting together where might the problem be? And I've identified 5 things that are often a problem, and I've got some possible solutions. Sometimes questions are too factual, right? So they just require assembling information. Here are some ways that we could tweak that. Sometimes they're too convergent. We tell kids what they're to believe. Here's a way we can address that. Sometimes they're a bit of a tangent, like, it's supposed to be about science, but it's really an ethical question, not a science question. How do I make sure it's focused on the curriculum that I'm supposed to be getting at? Sometimes it's too focused. We need to create a more open question. We need some things to try. Or too predictable. That's not really a good critical thinking question because the answer is kind of obvious, and we want to tweak it in this way. So those are some suggestions on what we might do to tweak it. And I want to show you one last piece I've been trying to get to, and sorry for the rush. I've been playing with this notion of a learning goal matrix. So what I want you to see here is I've gone into the curriculum, and I've simply, down the left, I've pulled out all the content expectations. And you can see the coding, but I've stripped away all the EGs and the verbs and the sample questions because I wanted to just know, in a nutshell, what is it I need to teach in grade 2 around traditions and celebrations. Across the top, these are the process. So the curriculum asks that kids should be formulating questions, gathering and organizing information, analyzing maps, interpreting information. So across the top is the way kids are supposed to engage with the curriculum. And down the left is the what. Now you're just seeing one page. This is about 3 or 4 pages. I want at a glance to be able to go, okay, so those are the 6 or 7 things kids need to learn about, and those are the things kids should be doing. Pick any cell you want, and what I'm doing is linking together a way of thinking with content. So let's take the second cell down, point 2 there, the structure of families, and move across and pick A2.4. Okay, so tomorrow's class, I want kids looking at the structure of families, and I know I'll get them to interpret and analyze information I provide and maybe draw conclusions. Oh, I just hit 2.4 and 2.5. Notice what I've done there. By linking, so instead of seeing the process as the project at the end, every day in my class, I'm going to link a content expectation with a process expectation. If you do this, you could not teach a lesson without inquiry because when I link them together, I have inquiry always happening. By the way, if I want to do my long-range plan, I use this guide just to plug in L1, L2, lesson 1, lesson 2. If I look and go, look, I've hit every row at least once somewhere, I've hit every column once, gee, I've met all the curriculum. If I find that, man, I have kids doing a lot of gathering and organizing information, but they rarely formulate questions, maybe I can balance that a little bit. So I don't know, again, I've done most of these for grades, social studies, grades 1 to 4, I think, or I can send a blank template. I have just found it helpful to look at the curriculum at a glance instead of having to read all the details. Yeah, good point, James. And you could simply add, I think, up front, and we could put the overalls in there. But the idea is to pull, like, just this is the what, this is the how. Let's make sure that they're always present. I'm going to finish with a couple of real quick. I touched on this one before. In grade 4, we asked kids to get in our time machine. By the way, inquiry in combined grades, just consider, let me give you a quick example. Grade 1, community. Grade 2, global community. Grade 3 is really, a section of that is really about communities local only 200 years ago, early settlers. Grade 4 is still communities, just the ancient. Imagine if we said to kids, how do we build sustainable, caring communities? The ones are going to look at how much are we a caring, sustainable community? 2s are going to see what can we learn from other countries. 3s are going to learn what can we learn from the past in our local past. 4s are going to go around the world. Like, wouldn't that be an interesting way? Now, by the way, just getting kids to weigh in, and then do you change your mind? using a ranking ladder. Here are 6 factors that contribute to climate change. There's room for 5 of them on my ranking ladder. Which 5 would you put on the list? Okay, sorry, we'll wrap up. Which 5 would you put on the list? As we work through the unit, would you change your order? Would you like to add new information to it, and so on? So in here, and when you get the post, here are some samples. This is grade 1. Notice my criteria, my thinking strategy. So I've got a bunch of samples of ways that we could organize the thinking. I don't want to go over. You've given up lots of your time. I hope there are bits and pieces in there that are helpful as you continue to explore. Let me just say, I think inquiry has potential to be hugely transformative, but we need to get it right. We need to make sure we build the supports kids need if we're going to get inquiry to work. Otherwise, we're going to find ourselves disappointed and inquiry getting lost again. So, I encourage us all to find the powerful ways to support kids, make them good thinkers so they can inquire in a meaningful way. I'm going to stop there and turn it back to Susan. And thanks, boy, this is some of the richest participation I've seen in the session. Thanks so much for that.
Garfield, that was an extraordinary session. Thank you so much. Thank you to all the participants as well. Throughout the session, I was tweeting out various comments that were made, and so if you're on Twitter, you can check some of that out later. Garfield, one of the things I love the most, you're experienced, many people who are here tonight, including myself, have heard you speak before, but I think one of the most wonderful things about your presentations is that you always share something new. I can't even count the number of times you said tonight that you were playing with something, and I'm just working this out. We don't hear you and hear the same thing you said last time. You're always stretching yourself, and therefore stretching us and pushing us. So thank you so very much for a terrific session that motivated and engaged and certainly has challenged us to keep on going in our growth when it comes to critical thinking and inquiry. I just want to say a couple of quick things. Carol, if you're still there, let me know your last name, please. I know some of you have seen me write that in the chat. One of the things I do behind the scenes is take attendance. I'm going to paste into the chat right now the link to the survey for tonight. One of the things that OTF really appreciates is your feedback, and the link on the screen on your whiteboard is actually clickable, and so is the link in the chat that I just put there. OTF uses this to guide their programming. They also use this to guide their funding, quite frankly. They take stats from all of these sessions and they take the feedback, and it has a great impact on what comes next in terms of OTF. And as I said at the outset, this program's been really growing, so we really appreciate your feedback. Many of you have been asking throughout the session about getting copies of some of the wonderful materials that were shared in Garfield's slideshow. So I know there's a few of you that are new to OTF tonight. So what happens as soon as you close out of the room tonight, you will get another link to the evaluation. They really want you to do that. And either later tonight or tomorrow morning, you will also get a link to the resources. And it comes in 2 forms. There's a recording of this entire thing, which I'll be turning off shortly. And there's also a list of resources. So all of the links that have been shared in the chat are taken out and are shared separately. So all of those wonderful slides that were part of the presentation tonight that would make great checklists in your classroom and so on, you will have access to all of those. So once again, I'll say thank you to all of you for a wonderful night of discussion and growth, and I'm going to stop the recording now.